Tazria Matzorah, this week's portion, I think is probably one of the least understood portions in the entire Bible. For those of you who are interested in skin ailments, weird bodily emissions, and well, let's just say gross stuff like that, this is your portion. For the rest of us, we arrive at it every single year and are kind of thrown back at what do we preach about? Because frankly, looking and reading about menstruation, bodily emissions, weird skin issues, it's kind of gross. The truth is that we weren't the only ones who struggled with how to read this. Well, when we look at even in the text itself, we kind of can only imagine that for the general Israelite, it wasn't a fun experience either. They had to determine if they were ritually pure enough to go up to the temple. Therefore, they had to visit the priests who had to look at everything. Kind of embarrassing in and of itself. And yet, when you think about it, you want to make sure that you're clean and ready to go before you go somewhere special like, I don't know, the White House or Windsor Palace or wherever it is. You're not going to show up oozing something. That's, really what it's about. But all the drips and drabs included, I think it's time for us to maybe look at how has this portion been understood over time? Did it stand the test of time? The answer, I think, is mixed, okay? So if we were to look at this from the history of ideas perspective, what do we learn? Well, we learned that when the Second Temple was destroyed, that just like there were parts of the musical tradition, I don't know if you are familiar, but the Levites had a whole tradition, and they had, if you look in Psalm 150, there's a whole litany of all of the musical instruments that they used, and all of the music that they once knew. Some of that was accidentally forgotten, and some of it was intentionally forgotten. So there are, when we look into the Bible, different pieces of evidence about different parts of music that existed. My argument is that probably the same thing when it comes to this. We certainly know that Sara'at or leprosy and all of the drips and dribbles and the skin ailments and all the creepy crawly things that we go to a dermatologist for today probably definitely existed. After all, there wasn't penicillin or other wonderful things like Vaseline around. But the idea that you had to really identify it and be wary of it, maybe not necessarily in the same way. Well, the temple didn't exist. And so you didn't need to have the priest identifying what kind of skin ailment you had. It no longer had meaning. So the rabbis felt free to decide, and they did. They made all sorts of fun midrash about it. They decided that it's a punishment, that it displays the physical manifestations of our internal failings, that it's an idea of Lashon Hara. They got all excited that Sara'at is related to Motzei Shem Ra, meaning that one has transgressed the entire 5 books. If you're getting where I'm going, they got creative. They had a fun moment because they had to decide how to make meaning out of something that frankly was really challenging to make meaning out of, especially since the temple didn't stand up or wasn't around anymore. By the time we get into Rambam, living about 1,000 years later, we see that this guy, Rambam, genius that he was, did take it seriously. He included it as part of his Mishnah Torah, specifically in Hilchot Tumat Sara'at. He goes on to describe how the Kohanim or the priest really examined everything super close just to make sure that blemish that you had reached beneath the surface, because if it did, that's what counted, he said. After all, it kind of makes sense that he got excited about blemishes and skin rashes and stuff. He was a physician, and he was excited about all of that sort of stuff. But we kind of look into long legal codes, and we see that it's thought to be related to illnesses and that the Bible had some sort of a way of understanding illnesses. That's why it's in there. We also see, though, that at times these laws were used to marginalize women and decide that women, because we menstruate, we're not pure. But that's not exactly, when we look at and use a historical critical approach or academic approach, what it's talking about either. It's talking about ritual purity when you're able to go into the temple. And if you recall, most likely you, Joe Schmo Israelite, that would be me too, would only go in there maybe 2 or 3 times a year at the most, maybe once or twice over the course of our lifetime. So what this meant was that the whole concept of a woman having to be put out of the camp because she was menstruating, and we see this in the books like The Red Tent, and that women are kind of put off to the side, that wasn't consistent with the ancient Near East. And of course, the whole historical critical approach, being the wonderful, fun academic approach, is an even later manifestation of how do we look at this text. Which brings me back to the question of today, where our obligation comes in. After all, we are Reformed Jews. We believe that it's up to us to study the text, to wrestle with it, and to come up with a modern meaning with it. So when I thought about it personally, I really thought about the fact that when we suffer, when we are internally struggling, I don't know about you, but sometimes it's hard for me to settle down and check in about what's going on. That we all can get overwhelmed with ruminations and ideas. And that sometimes we even decide that we're going to be so focused on ideas, like keeping up with the Joneses or having to participate in an active way in our consumeristic culture, that those are our spiritual dribbles that are dripping out and not allowing us to connect with God. After all, this whole thing was about how physical blemishes needed to be dealt with so that we could connect with God. I think for us today, it's really about spiritual blemishes that we need to address so that we can have a deeper connection with those around us. Our culture creates us, it puts us into moments of isolation. By being behind a screen, I'm sure you've all had the experience of going out to dinner and turning around at the other tables and seeing everybody's looking at a screen and nobody's interacting with other people. It's like we kind of forgot how to do that. It's why Gen Zs have all sorts of memes about suicide or other things which are frankly disturbing. Or millennials, I'm still excited that I am one, even though I'm a geriatric millennial, I think at this point, so I struggle with that whole concept, are very apt at using technology and can sometimes forget that there's an actual person who's reading our comments that we're making on TikTok, and they may actually be hurt by them. And we kind of get disconnected and forget. This portion, I think, reminds us and begs us to contemplate what is it that we need to clean so that we can purify ourselves to approach God. So I'll leave it in the ball in your court, and I'll ask you, what do you need to clean? What drips and dribbles are pestering you? Maybe you need to talk to the rabbi about it. Maybe you need to meditate on it. Maybe you just need to pray. But I think at the heart and core, that's what this portion is about. Shabbat Shalom.